So I loathe, it vexes me to my core when people use the phrase, God works in mysterious ways in response to really difficult, hard, uncomfortable questions. Because more often than not, what that response reveals in a person is a reluctance to linger and think deeply on uncomfortable things. In other words, it's like pulling out your phone in the midst of an awkward situation. It's a way to diffuse an uncomfortable situation so you don't have to deal with it. So if you find yourself wanting to say something like that, don't just say, I don't know. Now, in response to your question, Paul says this in Romans 8. He says, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Your question that you're asking isn't really anything unique. Anytime I make a video on Christian suffering, that God uses suffering to discipline us, to produce a peculiar weight of glory within us that will be revealed at the end, your type of question will always come up. And that's not to talk down on you. That's just to show that this is not anything unique. We all wrestle with this idea. Because we'll look at verses like this, and again, we remember kind of half of the verse, and we'll go, really, do all things work together for good? No, like seriously, do we really mean all things here? What about murder? What about genocide? What about sexual assault? What about human trafficking? What about slavery? Whatever we fill in the gap there is really just left up to our imagination, and it's usually those things that we have been most impacted by. Whether it's we have experienced it, or somebody that we know has experienced it, or we have just seen the devastation caused by the thing that we're talking about. Here's the thing though, we got to pay close attention to what Paul is actually saying. He says, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Here's the uncomfortable truth about what Paul is saying here. For the unbeliever, for the one who doesn't love God, suffering is ultimately chaotic and meaningless. If we refer back to Proverbs 5, which I used in the previous video, it talks about the person that rejects wisdom, that rejects discipline. And it says at the end of their life, they will say, how I hated discipline and how my heart despised correction. I didn't obey my teachers or listen closely to my instructors. I am on the verge of complete ruin before the entire community. Proverbs 1 would say of this person, since you neglected all my counsel and did not accept my correction, I in turn will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. There's this idea that's communicated time and time again throughout Scripture that those who don't love God, those who don't seek righteousness, in the end will meet destruction and calamity. And that's because they ultimately reject what the futility of this world is ultimately pointing to, namely the glorious freedom of God's children, who, as Proverbs 2 say, don't despise the Lord's instruction and don't loathe his discipline, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, just as a father disciplines the son in whom he delights. To put it in a more concrete way, all things work towards God.